Alrighty, we'll get started. Anybody need a handout? Alrighty. We got everybody this way, then just the Felsteads over here. Alrighty, so today we're going to be talking about, it's kind of relevant with 4th of July this weekend, the two kingdoms or the two realms. We've talked about this before. We're going to talk about it again. Partially, like I said, it just fits with 4th of July this weekend. And I didn't know how many people are going to be here. So I didn't want to answer a question somebody might have had with the probability of them actually being here when it's their question fairly low. Because who knows, 4th of July weekend, how many people are actually going to be here. So like I said, we've talked about this before, but I'll have two videos that will also kind of help our discussion to kind of think about the dangers when they kind of overlap, maybe when they're not supposed to, and maybe in different ways than we actually think, especially with the left kingdom coming into the right kingdom. So it's either kingdom or realm, doesn't really matter. You'll hear it both ways, the two kingdoms, the two realms. You'll hear it either way. So first, you know, when we say the two kingdoms, what are we talking about? It's how God rules, right? So God or Christ, he rules over both. He rules over the left kingdom. He rules over the right kingdom. He just does it in different ways. So basically, when we talk about the two kingdoms, it's how does God interact with his creation? How does he interact with the church, and how does he interact with his creation via the government? And usually that's kind of the two kingdoms, the church and the government. How does God interact with them? How does God use the church? How does God use the government? And he uses them in different ways for different things. And so this is kind of what we mean about the two kingdoms. So the left, you also hear about this. The left will be more temporal. So kind of think of government. When you hear the left kingdom is the temporal. How does God use the government? And this very much is we use temporal because on the last day when Christ comes back, who will be the government? Well, God will be, right? And so it's temporal simply because it's not going to be for eternity, just kind of here now. The right, on the other hand, we call it the church, but it's also the spiritual realm. The church. And we make these distinctions simply because it helps us, right? As we try to figure out how do we live as God's people, what does it mean? These kind of distinctions help us. So in the left kingdom, the law is central. This will be the same list. We talked about this. I want to say 1 Corinthians 8. So, I mean, that's probably like 7 months ago, if not later. But it'll be the same list. So, on the left, the law is central, right? God uses the law. The government uses the law, right? The government creates laws. They enforce laws. The law is central to what they do. Once again, the law is not a bad thing, right? It keeps us safe if it's a good law, right? We're talking about just laws here. It's a good thing. God uses the government to have laws to protect the citizens, to help the citizens, these kinds of things, right? So on the right, on the flip side, right, the gospel is central. That's supposed to be an A. It is. That doesn't look right. Huh. So gospel is should be the predominant thing within the church, right? Now, obviously, right, as Lutherans, we talk about law and gospel, but the gospel should be first and foremost. This should be central to all we do, what Christ has done for us, right? It is central to what the church should be doing. So therefore, the left is concerned with relationships between people. Right? Relationships between people. I'm going to do /creation. This would be, if you remember our, or if you don't even remember, but our Latin words, learn some Latin today. This would be the coram mundo. Right, so if we have our two kinds of righteousness, this would be the horizontal. I had to think a second between the difference between vertical and horizontal. So this would be the coram mundo, right? How are we righteous before one another, right? Between one another and within the relationship also within creation, right? We go back to Genesis 2 when God gives Adam the command to steward creation, right? So these kinds of things. So the government is concerned with the relationship between people and creation, right? How do we relate to one another? What does this mean? And then also to creation. On the other hand, the church is predominantly relationship with God, right? This would be the coram Deo. So the coram Deo. Now, as you probably are already noticing, right, there is some overlap, right? Does the church concern itself about this? The answer is yes, right? My sermon concerned ourselves about this. For those of you who are in early church, right? Our relationship between one another. But primarily the church is, what is our relationship with God? What does that look like? What does it matter, right? Which is once again focused on the gospel. What does God do for us? And so this is what we begin to see. So as I talked about before, right, the government is the responsible institution. Close enough. Right here it's the church. Right? So God gives us the government to do these things. To create these laws, to look over these laws. They're the responsible institution, right? You see this especially in like 1st and 2nd Samuel, but throughout the Bible, right? Rulers are accountable to God, right? As we all are, but rulers are accountable to God for how they rule, the laws they do, these kinds of things, right? So it's a responsible institution, once again governed by Christ, right? Christ still oversees all of these things. They are held accountable. If not in this life, the next life. Like I said, and then over here, no surprise, the church is the one who God uses for the sake of the gospel. Talk about the relationship with God. So then over here, he uses civil servants. Right? He uses civil servants to get these things done. And then over here is the servants of the word. These are just simply the people he uses to carry out these things. So how does the left do this? How do they enforce these things? The left uses the sword. Paul will talk about this quite a bit in Romans, right? God has given the government the power of the sword, right? The government can wield the sword for the sake of, keeping peace, for the sake of enforcing the law, right? We all know what happens if the government doesn't use the sword to enforce the law, right? People then just start doing whatever because, there's no consequences, right? He gives the government the use of the sword to do these things. Over here, on the other hand, you have uses the word, right? So when you hear, when you go to church, right? Obviously, the gospel should be central, but you should hear the word, right? In the church, you should hear the word. You shouldn't hear about other things. There should be the word being preached, the proclamation of the word. So notice the church doesn't wield the sword, the government does. So this is interested in ethics, right? Interested in ethics. This is interested in the means of grace. Right, so the government is interested in how people behave, What does it mean to behave? These kinds of things, right? Every government wants ethical citizens. They may have a different view of what ethical means, but they want ethical citizens, right? They want citizens to follow what they want to do, right? They want ethical citizens. On the other hand, the right is means of grace, right? This would be the sacraments, the word. How does God give us his grace, right? This is what we would say word and sacrament. We're concerned about the means of grace. Alrighty, then over here is preserve and protect. Right? A good government preserves and protects. So P and P over here, it's redeem and restore. Redeem and restore. Right? We preach the gospel, law and gospel, we redeem people, restore them back to the relationship, back to God the way it's supposed to be. Right? We restore them. Here, the aims at justice. Right? A good government should aim at justice. Here we aim at justification. So very similar, but notice one's just justification usually is between us and God, and then justice is between us and others. Cum mundo compared to cum Deo. Now, as we see, right, a lot of them overlap, right? Especially, what does ethics look like? What does it mean to preserve and protect? What does justice look like, right? Justice is a big topic in our current political climate, right? You have people who believe, justice means reparations. You say no. Other people, say no. That's not justice at all. In fact, that's the opposite of justice, right? So there's this battle. Even what does justice mean? And so this is where, the church can have input. No, this is what justice looks like. This is what God says justice is. And if this is what God says is justice, well, then that's justice, right? So there's goings back and forth between the two. But the church is primarily focused on the gospel of these things, while we leave the government to do these things. Like I said, there's overlap, and a good government will also help the church, right? And the church should also help the government. There's overlap as they go back and forth. It's not rigid. Well, that's the law. We don't deal with that. Like, no. We inform the government, hey, this is unjust. Hey, no, this is what should be happening. But we also understand that that's the government's role to create these laws, not the church's role to create these laws. Any questions about those things? Alrighty, I have 2 videos they'll be interesting. I think they'll generate some discussion. The first video, which will actually be, I guess the first question here, are the 2 kingdoms opposed to one another? No, right? The 2 kingdoms shouldn't be opposed to one another, right? Christ is the ruler over both kingdoms. They're not opposed to one another. It's simply, how does God work? What should the church be concerned with? What should the government be concerned with the most, right? So they're not opposed to one another. We shouldn't think, government's bad, or, people shouldn't think church is bad. No, they should work in tandem. They should work together. But each have their role and their place. So we're actually going to, I put these in the wrong order. The last one, what is the danger of the left kingdom trying to be the right kingdom? Right, no. Yeah, yep. What is the danger of the left? We're going to look at that one first. It's interesting. So we'll have the video. I'll leave you guys time to discuss, because I think it'll generate some discussion. The guy who we'll be watching, he's a prof at St. Louis, fantastic prof, probably my favorite, Professor Bierman, Dr. Bierman. And he'll be talking about what happens when the left kind of influences the church, when the government kind of in ways we might not think about, right? Anytime we think about, the government influencing the church, we kind of think about, well, the government has a say, this is when you can do worship, you can do these things. And he takes a slightly different route in ways I don't think we often talk about or think about. So I think it'll be good to listen to hear what he has to say. Now, two things before we start the video. Two things I think that will help us. First, he talks about adiaphora. That's supposed to be an O. What does adiaphora mean? You guys remember? So it's neither commanded nor forbidden. So these are the things we would say, hey, the Bible doesn't really talk about them. So they're not commanded, they're not forbidden, but there are a place for them. Now, not all adiaphora is created equal. So an adiaphora thing would be, hey, we're thinking about, putting carpet in the church. Should we do that? That's adiaphora. It's not commanded, nor forbidden. It doesn't deal with doctrine, right? Adiaphora usually doesn't deal with doctrinal things. Most voters' meetings are adiaphora, dealing with stuff that's adiaphora. Hey, we have some extra money. Where should we do it? Should we go to this this place or this place? Where should we donate it? That's kind of adiaphora. Both places are good. It doesn't matter. Some Greek, since I know you guys all care. Some interesting Greek grammar, just so you understand a little bit. This is called, the alpha. It's called alpha primitive. So in the Greek, they put an alpha before the word to kind of negate it. And so this would be kind of the negation of diaphora. Diaphora is something that's commanded. So adiaphora is something that's not commanded. Kind of interesting. So if you see kind of something's a Greek word with an A in front, it negates it. So adiaphora is something that it negates. So he'll talk about adiaphora, right? Something that's neither commanded nor forbidden. That doesn't mean it's not important. It's still important, but it's not really doctrinal matters. The other one will be, he'll talk about Franz Pieper. Ooh, that's an S, not a Z. Oh boy. Franz Pieper, he was the 4th president of the LCMS. He wrote 3, I have them in my office, 3 volumes of Lutheran dogmatics, Lutheran teachings. And so so I didn't have to read his dogmatics in seminary, but Pastor Drevlo did. Up to maybe the last 5 to 10 years, every seminarian had to read his dogmatics. So Pieper is very influential within the Lutheran Church, even to this day. Even though I think he died in like 1927, someplace around there. And so he'll bring up Pieper's dogmatics, and just so you understand kind of who Pieper is, why he brings him up. He's just a very influential guy for pastors and just in the Lutheran Church as well. Alrighty, so our first video will be dealing with when the church doesn't act maybe like the church. My computer hasn't been wanting to work lately. No. Believe it or not, I do actually want to click on that. There we go.
Many of the students who had me in the seminary in their 4th year will know that I was very fond of this book, Kurt Marquardt's book, The Church and Her Fellowship, Ministry, and Governance. It's a book chock full of really great teaching about the church and the relationship between the church and the pastor, the pastoral office. Lots of good stuff in here, heavy-duty doctrine. And it's a great example of a little sidebar note that I like to make, that I believe theology is far more interesting and usually far more helpful when it's done by an individual than by committee. Committee theology tends to be rather predictable, often insipid, and not so interesting, whereas theology done by an individual is always idiosyncratic and therefore quite interesting and makes it far more engaging. Marquardt is a great example of that. All of his little style and his little pet peeves come through strongly, and it makes it a really engaging read. Now, All that's true, but today I want to focus on one little part of his text on page 203 when Marquardt's talking about church polity and how things are supposed to work in the church. And he has here a little paragraph which I have found to be exceedingly insightful and so profoundly important if we would actually take it seriously in how we operate as the church. So here's the paragraph. Those who urge that nothing beyond local congregations can really be a church often do so without adequate theological reflection, simply in order to avoid the spiritual tyranny of a superchurch, whatever that is. This well-meaning argument is badly mistaken, however. Now here's the key part. It is precisely as churches that synods are controlled by faith and love, and therefore cannot tyrannize anybody. The more this churchly constitution and its constraints are forgotten and replaced by political notions of majority rule and commercial chains of command, the more scope there is for worldly carnal powers and all its works. This goes to the heart of the question of the nature of church government. That's profound. What Marquardt is arguing here is that we need to remember that the church is the church. We need to treat the church like the church, and we need to operate like the church is the church. Now, this seems like a tautology, of course, the church is the church, but we need to think about what this really means. Because if the church is operating like the church, that means we are normed by faith and by love and not by power and authority and command and trying to get our way and trying to assert our rights. That's the way of the world. It's not the way of the church. The way of the church is sacrifice, giving of self for the sake of the other, letting love be the dominant thing, trusting Christ's command and following him in faith. That's the way of the church. It's not the way of the world. And so what Marquardt is reminding us is that we need to think about the church at the congregational level, at the district level, at the synodical level, as church and not as a political institution. There is a gross mistake that gets perpetuated in our circles when the church is being described as, well, it's a political institution. And I've even heard the argument being made, and being made rather emphatically, that, well, this is the issue of the two kingdoms. So the church has the spiritual component and a temporal component. And its temporal component, it's a political institution. And so it operates with political rules. And then as the spiritual institution, it operates with spiritual rules. This is exactly what Marquardt's warning against. We can't make this weird bifurcation and use the two kingdoms teaching as an excuse for the church to look and act like the world and like worldly institutions. That's junk. And it happens, I think, way too often. We use the excuse that, well, the church is after all, a temporal institution, and it has to just function with temporal rules. That's an excuse to look like the world. The church needs to look and act like the church, even when we're doing political things, even when we're carrying out actions which are constitutionally directed or whatever. So what does this mean concretely when I'm arguing that the church needs to look like the church? What I'm getting at is that we need to be consistent in how we operate. We are always Christ's church in the world, whether at the congregational level, the district level, a seminary institution, or the synodical level. We are the church, and we need to look and act and witness like we are the church, and not sort of pick which one we want to do whenever it's convenient. Oh, now we'll act like the world, and we'll play by the world's rules because we're doing a worldly thing, and now the church can have an excuse to just be playing the game of the world. And then other times now we're going to be the church and play the church spiritual reality card, and we kind of play it both ways. That's not the way to operate with the two kingdoms. That's not what we're thinking about here at all. The church is Christ's reality at work in the world. We need to look like it. So, when does this get violated? I think it gets violated in conventions a lot. When we start thinking that Robert's rules are the supreme order of the day over against even biblical injunctions. And maybe a corollary of this is when you have synodical institution leaders, or when you have people just functioning within the church, whatever synod you're in, and it's the bylaws of the synod in the Constitution or in the bylaws that become the norm of how we operate, rather than clear words from God's own scriptures. And this happens sometimes. I've actually heard an individual tell me once that, yeah, I probably should talk to my brother about this problem we've got over something, but the bylaws forbid it because of our roles. That's nonsense. That's absolute nonsense, that the bylaws would take precedence over scriptural direction, but it happens. And see, this is an example of the world creeping in and directing how we operate in the church instead of operating like the church. Or it happens when we have the church invoking its right to use the courts to secure its rights for the sake of its rights. And that's the world talking again. The church doesn't do that. The church is not interested in securing her rights, fighting for her place, getting her fair share. The church doesn't do that. That's why St. Paul gives us clear admonition in 2 Corinthians that we don't sue each other. We don't run off to the courts to solve things because we're the church. We operate in a different way. We operate in a different attitude towards each other. We have a different set of rules that guide us in the church. It also means that we don't always just simply try to figure out how we can get our way by getting the most votes. The majority does not rule in the church. And this is a classic example of us looking more like Americans than like Christians, when we think that somehow democracy is God's chosen way, and if the majority has decided, well, then that's God's will. It's nonsense. The majority does not decide anything. This is very clear on doctrine, but it also comes into play when it comes to adiaphora. We need to be careful of operating with the notion that somehow, well, the majority has voted, therefore they have the right to exercise their authority and get what they want to have done. The majority doesn't run things, Christ does. And if Christ is running things, that means faith and love are the dominant things. Now, Marquardt reminds us of this wonderful section in Pieper's Dogmatics. And I'm going to go right to Pieper on this one. And this is in Volume 3 of Pieper's Dogmatics. And Pieper, of course, is the standard of this is what theology looks like when you're doing it hardcore, faithfully well. And yet it's chock full of all these concrete little practical things that Pieper is so fond of giving us. So in Volume 3 on page 430, he writes this about church voting. And this is the very end of his discussion about the church and about the church's polity. And he's almost to the end, getting ready to shift gears and move into the office of the ministry. And he's offering some concrete kind of direction here. And he says this: in adiaphora, in other words, if it's not an issue of doctrine settled in Scripture and by the church's teaching, but in adiaphora, which is anything not doctrinal, which is most of what we probably talk about when it comes to church discussions at voters' meetings and at church council meetings and at synodical and district conventions. In adiaphora, a vote is taken to ascertain what the majority regards as the best. The natural order is that in adiaphora, the minority yields to the majority and acquiesces, not because the majority has the right to rule, but for love's sake. If we're trying to figure something out, and most people seem to want this, it would make sense to say, all right, the minority should say, well, if most of you want this, in love, we'll yield to you, let's go ahead and do that. It kind of makes sense. Not because they have an inherent right, because they're the majority. That's democratic thinking. That's American thinking. No, it's just a way to kind of settle things that makes sense, kind of helps most people. We'll go with what most people want. But then Pieper continues this. Since, however, love is queen here, it may happen that the majority will yield to the minority. Wow! The majority would yield to the minority. Why? When would that happen? Well, what would happen when the majority recognizes that although they might have the most votes, this minority group with their opinion is so strong in their opinion that it would actually fracture the love they have, or maybe even cause a division within the church. There's a compelling argument here that sometimes, for the sake of unity, the majority needs to yield to the minority. And you might say, well, then that's the minority just kind of playing their little baby card and having their way because they make a tantrum. Well, maybe, but that's still the majority's responsibility to say, what are we doing to foster unity and love here, and not just saying we've got the most votes, therefore we win. It doesn't work that way in the church. In the church, we ask the question, what is fostering love? What is bringing unity? And for the sake of unity and love, sometimes we make sacrifices, and sometimes the majority even yields to the minority for the sake of love and unity. So, in this season of conventions, which happens every 3 years in our church body on a regular basis, district level and then synodical level, maybe we should be asking the question a little more carefully. What does love dictate us to do, instead of just who's got the votes, who's got the right procedure, who knows how to play the game, the shrewdest and the smartest to get things done the way they want them done? It's adiaphora, people. We're just talking about preferences and ways of doing things. Doctrine is clear-cut. Scripture's told us what we need to do. The church's teaching is there. In issues of adiaphora, we need to be thinking more about what's the loving thing to do here? What's going to give for the sake of unity, to bring unity and fullness and love to us and how we operate together. And sometimes maybe the majority needs to say, what do we need to do to help bring this minority group back into full fellowship with us and back into a stronger sense of union that we have, instead of just saying, well, look, we got the votes, we won, you guys have to deal with it. That's not how the church operates. It's not how we should operate. Let's act like the church. And let's heed the admonition that the church needs to be the church in how she operates all the time, in every situation, always witnessing the reality of Christ and his love and his ways of operating.
That's why there was an echo. I didn't realize you turned on my mic. So you can obviously see he's also responding to a specific thing. So I'll give you a few minutes, talk at your tables, things, just things that caught your attention, maybe things you agree with, disagree with. I'll give you a few minutes and then we'll convene back as a group and talk about it. Alrighty, what'd you guys talk about? I'll cut it a little short considering the next video is 15 minutes and we're... So thoughts. That is really loud. Yeah. Yeah, he's saying, no, in that case, you're still the church. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I can maybe find those. Yeah. Yeah, I have peepers. Mark Wort might be harder, but that one you might be able to find online. Because Mark Wort is a pretty old guy. I don't even think he's alive anymore. So that, yeah, I'll see, maybe I can find that, right? Right, but what's interesting then, you begin to see how it's not even it's not even the left beginning to impose on the right, it's the right beginning to drift to be more like the left, the dangers of that. And Bierman makes the point, no, you're the church. Act like the church, right? Don't make this separation. Oh, this is left-hand stuff, this is right-hand stuff. No. You're the right hand. Act like the right hand. Yeah. Yeah, it changes how we begin to think. Any other thoughts? Yeah, the majority can yield to the minority. That just because the majority is the majority doesn't mean inherently they have the right. Right? What should govern us is not just bylaws and majorities, but grace and love and unity. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very different, almost anti-American way to think of actually. Pastor I know has talked about in Bible study at Votus meetings that I think it's the African church, they don't leave until everyone agrees. They don't leave until everyone agrees, right? Yeah, and it would be a long meeting, right? And Bierman even kind of points out, he's like, it's usually kind of for this sake of, speediness. Well, majority have it, we move on. Well, maybe the Africans have it right? If we're going to be the church and we're going to be unified, we should all agree, even though that's going to take a while. We shouldn't be influenced by, what's expedient or what does, everybody else do. Yeah. Yep. The jury works that way. Yeah. Yep. So yeah, the majority might yield to the minority. Yeah, for the sake of love and unity. All right. Good. Anything else? I don't think you have an actual response, Ronnie. Anything else? Yeah. What's best for the church, and I think this is part of Bierman's point, is oftentimes that ends discussion. We vote. Here are the votes. That ends discussion. We move on, right? And I think Bierman's point, and Pieper's point would be, no, that gives us a data point. Hey, this is what people are saying, but we shouldn't then just simply move on. Right? The minority might say, yep, for the sake of unity, let's go with it. Let's be unified and do this. It's the same reason, Pastor Andreessen did this. If you remember all of our call meetings, right? Pastor Andreessen would always have a vote. He wouldn't make the call until there was a unanimous vote to call that pastor, right? The point being is, no, we're unified in this. We might have had disagreements, right? But we're now unified in this. This is what the direction we're going. And so people would make the point, no, this gives us a data point, but we shouldn't maybe just end discussion there. We should try to be unified. Yeah. Alrighty. So the next one is interesting. It's 10:11. We won't have much time afterwards. A Christian America, it's titled. So this will be very much the right trying to kind of impose on the left. And so hopefully it'll be loud enough. This was quieter than the previous one, so hopefully it'll be loud enough.
Through the years, I frequently made a comment that my goal as a Christian living in America is not a
I'll try to
Christian
figure something else
America,
out.
but a just America. The first of a few political videos that will be coming in the coming year. World around us, the church and the state, the church and the wider culture around us.
Here's what we'll do. I'll put subtitles on. I was hoping the microphone would just pick it up, but it did not. So I'll put subtitles on, and hopefully that'll help us. I apologize. I was going to test beforehand, and then I forgot.
Extremely interested in those things, and I think we need to sort
Where's
those
my
things
mouse?
out.
There it is.
So this will be my first kind of deliberately political video here, I suppose. I frequently made a comment that my goal as a Christian living in America is not a Christian America, but a just America. And I often get questions about that, or even pushback on that, and people to challenge that notion. I want to explain a little more what I mean by that and lay out why I believe this is the right way for us as Christians to think. So I'm going to start by doing a little bit of foundational work here, kind of from a political standpoint, and my guess is this might be the first of a few political videos that will be coming in the coming year. I'm very interested in the relationship of the church and the world around us, the church and the state, the church and the wider culture around us. Extremely interested in those things, and I think we need to sort those things out. So this will be my first kind of deliberately political video here, I suppose. So let's start by doing some groundwork things. What is the basic paradigm we're thinking about here is the distinction between the two realms. Sometimes people call this the doctrine of the two kingdoms. I don't like that language. I think that's a misleading way of thinking about it. I prefer to use the verbiage of the distinction between the two realms, the realm of God's spiritual authority in the world and the realm of God's temporal authority in the world, and the way that God works in a spiritual way through his church and the way that God works in a temporal way through the rest of the world around to accomplish his purposes. In the spiritual realm, it is the church that is the institution God has established to make sure that that work of the spiritual realm is going on. And what is that work? The proclamation of the gospel, the forgiveness of sins in Jesus Christ, which makes individuals right, which redeems the whole world and the whole creation and brings it back into a right relationship with God the Father, with the creator of everything. The task of the church, the number one task of the church, is to proclaim the gospel and to witness God's reality to the world around. So we exist for the sake of the world. Very important premise, that we have the task of proclaiming the gospel to the world and witnessing God's reality to the world. So what is the number one task of the state? Well, the state exists as God's institution to oversee the temporal realm, the realm of this life, the coram mundo realm, whereas the spiritual is dealing with the coram deo realm, before God, before the world, just what the Latin means. So the state is there as the institution God has established to do what? To uphold God's purposes for the creation, to uphold God's justice that is conforming to God's will, which is another way of saying God's law. So what the state should be doing is upholding the way that God wants the world to work. That's what good governments do. They help the world function the way God intends the world to function. Now, in a broken world, things get all messed up because the church doesn't always fulfill its task the way it should because it's filled with broken people, and the state doesn't fulfill its task the way it should because it's filled with broken people. And yet, both tasks still remain, the task of the church and the task of the world. One is doing the gospel, one is upholding the law. Both are God's purposes, both are important to God, and both should be done for the sake of God's will being accomplished, the gospel being proclaimed, the law being upheld. So that's the basic premise here, the task of the church and the task of the state. They're different, but they're also not mutually exclusive, and they can be quite complementary. That's fascinating stuff to get into maybe more another time. So now let's get back to my driving question today. Do I want the Christian government? And you would think you'd say, well, if the government's task is to uphold God's law, it would make sense that I would want a Christian government. And would it be true that I would love to have an entire government that was founded on God's reality, God's truth, God's law, committed to proclaiming God's reality? Yeah, that would be great. No argument about it. It would be awesome to live in a place, in a country, in a nation where the entire nation was saying, we want to do what God wants. We want to honor God's will. We want to do God's purposes. We want to bring God's justice to bear in the world. That would be awesome. How cool would it be when we could actually have discussions in a government setting, in a public setting, that instead of maybe arguing about abortion rights, we were talking about whether or not we should outlaw divorce outright. I would love to be able to talk about things like divorce instead of things like abortion as the driving issues. Maybe, wouldn't it be great if we were all agreed that God's will is for marriage to thrive, so maybe we should outlaw divorce? That'd be awesome to have that conversation. Wouldn't it be great to live in a country where instead of discussing transsexual rights for the trans community, we are instead discussing whether or not we should be honoring and giving a tax break to those who are active participants in the church and going to church on a regular basis on Sunday mornings, and maybe even punishing those who don't attend church. That way we're helping to uphold the third commandment against the Sabbath breaking. And wouldn't that be great? Yeah, I think it would be awesome to be in a nation where we're having those kinds of discussions instead of the kind of discussions we have where we are. So would I love a Christian government? Yeah. And would I love everybody in my government to be a Christian, knowing Christ's love, knowing the salvation they have in Christ? Yeah. I want all the world to be saved. This is God's will. He wants all men to come to knowledge of the truth. So do I. So would I want every American to be a Christian? Yes. And I pray for this. We work for this. We want everyone to hear the gospel and to come to know that truth and to live in it. So I would love that to happen. So why not embrace then this notion of a Christian America? Let's go for it. Well, there are several theological reasons why we shouldn't embrace that. So let me get into those and make this clear. So, just want to be clear here. Do I want a government acting in a Christian way? That would be awesome. Do I want God's law upheld by the government? Sure. And by the way, can you legislate morality? Of course. There's nothing wrong with that. There's always some morality being legislated. The question is, whose? And would I rather it be God's morality than someone else's? Of course. So I just want to be clear on that. Now, so why not embrace the notion of, then let's get a Christian government. Let's go for it. Let's get a Christian America. Let's do it. Let's start fighting for this now. Let's work hard at it. So there are several key theological reasons and a few practical reasons I want to give. First key theological reason is from Jesus' own mouth when he told Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." So we have here a clear word that we should not be expecting God to establish his kingdom in this world now. We're not expecting things to be perfect or there. Now we've got our Christian government. That's not an objective that Jesus told us we should have. We should be striving instead for God's truth to be declared and for things to be working as best as we can to the right way, but we're not trying to establish a Christian rule of the world now. That will come when Christ returns. So we have an eschatological hope, and we're living in the not yet. We have to always remember that. We can't force the now to become more fully now by getting things in place and making a Christian government. It's not going to happen. Jesus himself told us, don't expect that, don't work for that. So that, to me, is probably the best single reason, and it's the first one. But there's more. Second reason is Romans 13. Romans 13 says that God gives the sword to the government to enforce the law, his law. That's the sword. The sword is all about justice. It's all about life taking and preserving. It's even doing necessary force when necessary and even taking life. Church is not in that world. That's not our game. So the church doesn't get itself involved in wielding the sword. The church has never wielded the sword and should never wield the sword. And when we start talking about a Christian government, those lines of distinction get very blurred, and that's problematic. So that's the second reason. Third reason why we shouldn't have a Christian government from a theological standpoint is because of the reality of the simul justus et peccator. We are at the same time saint and sinner, justified and still sinful. That's true of even the very best Christian. Nobody ever arrives. We're always in process. The simul is very true. And so if we have inherently sinful people, we should be very wary of entrusting them with too much authority, too much power, because the temptations to abuse and dropping the ball are very real. We all know this. History bears it out again and again and again. But it's not just a pragmatic concern, it's a theological one. Theologically, we are simul justus et peccator. Theologically, we are sinful and not to be counted on. Christ makes that clear. And even the most sanctified person is still going to be a sinner. And so it's a very precarious thing to put all of the authority in one place. And that's one of the reasons why things like divided power, checks and balances are really wise when we have sinful human beings, which are inherently sinful and tend not to do right things. So that's the third theological reason. And there's a fourth. And the fourth one is the church has a number one task. Remember, proclaim the gospel. If the church is in the business of helping rule the world or running the government, and we have a Christian government and they're working together and they're all cooperating here in a kind of collapsing of them into one, it's so easy for the church to forget what it's supposed to be doing. The church's number one task is not law enforcement or justice proclamation. The church's number one task is gospel proclamation. The church's number one role is making people right with the Creator and bringing God's reality to bear there. Now, does the church have a whole lot to say to the world and a whole lot more interest besides just doing the gospel? Yes, yes, yes. And I will talk about that probably in future videos. The church has a responsibility, clearly laid out scripturally, in our confessions as well. We don't just walk away from the world and leave the two separated. A separation of the church and the state is a huge problem, and it's a very common Lutheran failing. But more on that another time. So those are my four theological reasons why a Christian government is a wrong goal for the church, that we shouldn't be striving for that. Striving for justice, yes. Striving for more uprightness, yes. Now, I've got a few practical reasons. And the first practical reason is simply this. We're living in a modern nation state called the United States of America, or whatever nation state you happen to be living in. Modern nation states are a relatively new idea. That's why I'm calling it a modern nation state. It didn't used to be this way, but it is how it is now. And we live further in a democratic republic, which means we are the government and the people do the electing. And a democratic republic is inherently pluralistic, and so that means it becomes really hard for one group to assert their authority over others unless everybody wants it. Now again, if everybody was Christian, we're cool. That's great. So in a sense, what I'm saying is, instead of Christians fighting to try to take control of the government or get the right people elected, why don't we just be honest about who we are and lay things out? And if a Christian can say, here's what I believe, we should be doing God's will, I think all abortions are wrong, and I think divorce is wrong, and just lay that out and go get elected. See what happens. And if you can get yourself elected, then rule that way. That's great. My suspicion is that in a pluralistic culture that we're living in the late period of the Enlightenment into the post-Enlightenment, post-modernity world, the world we're living in now, that's not going to go very far. And if you become overtly Christian, the chances of your gaining election are very slim, unless you happen to be in one of those little gerrymandered little districts that are perfectly cut out for you. So the problem is, will anybody listen to us? Will anybody elect us? Will anybody vote for us if we become overtly Christian? And I think we all know from the temper of America and the things we've been seeing in the last few decades that those chances of that are exceedingly slim. So that mean we stop? It means we don't get involved? No, no. We still stay involved. We keep speaking. You can run for office, run for school boards, run for any office you want, and be as Christian as you want to be, and see what happens. And pragmatically, are we going to achieve our authority? I doubt it. And should we? Should we want the church to be taking over? Again, you see, I think that's missing the point of what the church should do. Now, my second reason here, pragmatically, maybe, is even still quite theological, and it's even more compelling, and that is, I'm very concerned that when the church starts to fight to become a player in the world and having a voice on the government stage and even taking over government or enforcing its rules for government, I get very concerned that that very process of that fight greatly diminishes the church's witness to the world. And this is going to be my consistent theme through all the kinds of things I teach. I'm very concerned about the witness we're giving to the world of God's reality. And when the church starts to act like everybody else in the world, we're not giving a witness to the uniqueness of Christ coming into the world with a message of forgiveness of sins in Christ, in the gospel, and of a love that surpasses all things. We're not showing that. We're showing that we're fighting for our way and demanding our rights and demanding our ways of doing things. And we lose our distinct witness. Now, do we still fight for God's truth? Yes, but we need to do it in a way that's careful, that doesn't diminish the overall witness of the church. And I get greatly concerned that when we start fighting for a Christian America, what that ends up conveying to the America around us is we're one more special interest group trying to fight for our way, and we should be carefully controlled and kept in line. And we don't need to perpetuate that sort of understanding. That's my concern. So, what should we be fighting for? An America that is following God's will. I want that. So do I keep on voting and getting involved and talking to senators or making contacts with people in the legislature and even running for office? Yes, do all that. We work hard. What we need to do is we need to pray for our government and pray for our leaders and pray for our constitutional upholders, our
judges and our legislators and our president, pray for them. And we need to speak God's truth. And we need to work hard within the world to try to bring justice, God's justice, more to bear. And we need to trust that God's in control and be always mindful of the witness that we're giving to the world. And so as we do that, our goal then is a faithful church that witnesses the reality of Christ and speaks the gospel, and a just government. I want both of those things. That's my goal, and I'm going to strive for that. And am I looking to try to collapse them into one? Not at all. Not this side of the eschaton. And am I trying to get a Christian government? I want a just government. I'll be content with that. And so I'm going to keep on striving for that. And I think the very verbiage of a Christian government sends the wrong kind of messages and gets things out of whack, or the idea that Christian America is missing the point of what we should be striving for, knowing what we know about God's reality and about our theological situation. So we need to make sure that we're clear in witnessing to the world that Jesus is Lord, not Caesar, and not a president, and not a candidate, and not America. America's not our Savior. America's not our God. America's not our new church. America's the country God has given us to delight in and to work for and to benefit from and to help serve the rest of the world through that. And that's a wonderful thing. And I understand the beauty of that. But we need to be careful not to make America more than it is. Jesus is Lord, and that's the witness we need to give to that world we're living in. So we have confidence doing that, and we also have diligence in doing that, knowing that Jesus is indeed our Lord and will indeed bring his will to bear in the world in which we live.
All righty. So it is 10:30 already. Hopefully you're able to catch most of it or read most of it. I apologize for it being so soft. Thoughts on this? I said thoughts. First impressions.
Interesting that he didn't think government should be Christians necessarily.
Yeah, and I think what he's talking about, right, as he mentioned, the kind of the configuration or the collapse of the church into the government, right? As he talks about Christian government, that'd be awesome, but we shouldn't necessarily be concerned of the church coming into. Yeah, I think that's a good example of Rome, or they call it Constantinianism. So the Byzantine Empire is a good example of the collapse between the two. Yeah.
I would, however, rather vote for a Christian than a non-Christian, so that some of those values are a part of that person's decision-making.
Yeah. Rather vote for a Christian than a non-Christian. Yeah. And his point, right, is by all means, continue to be in the government to do these things. We should just not be completely concerned about got to make it Christian. No, there is this place, right? He's very cognizant that, right, there's a place for the church and a place for God's rule through the government. Anything else? Yeah, fighting for power, right? He makes this distinction. By all means, run, do these things, but if we're fighting for our power, fighting for these things, then are we actually witnessing about Christ and who he is, right? A good example, I can think of two. One's in the Bible, right? John the Baptist. This is maybe not fighting for power, but speaking out, right? John the Baptist speaks out against Herod, marrying his brother's wife, and he ends up being executed, right? But that's a good example of, hey, no, you speak out for justice. Hey, this is not right. Now there might be consequences. The other example is Justin Martyr. He's 150 AD around there. He wrote to the government saying, hey, you guys are persecuting us Christians. Why? We pay our taxes. We're good, loyal citizens. Why are you doing this? Right? So there, he's not necessarily fighting for his place of power, or the place of the Christians, but he is going to the emperor actually and basically saying, hey, why are you doing this? Right? He's still a witness. Hey, we're doing all of these things right. Why are you doing this? Right? So there's a way to stand up, to speak, to do these things, but still be witnessing to who Christ is and what he has done. Yeah, sometimes it's hard, right? This wanting to be in power and to have power, to be seen as legitimate. It's sometimes hard. Anything else? Alrighty. Well, hopefully this kind of helps think between the right and the left kingdom and how we should interact with the government, what the church should do, right? The church should be the church, how that means for how we act with one another, what does that mean for voters' meetings, stuff like that. Hopefully this helps and gives you some things to think about. So let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you.